Oh, Kinesiology 223, Chapter 7, still on feedback, reinforcement, intrinsic motivation. This is book presentation number 8, and we're talking more about intrinsic motivation. You can tell this is kind of a hot button, sweet spot issue within this book, in this chapter. Competition and intrinsic motivation, autonomy, supportive behavior, excuse me. The authors, they know a couple of different studies here, and I try not to bury you guys in different studies and trying to have you remember particular studies and equate that to different outcomes. I want you to just get the general context of what we're talking about in this class. But they note 2 studies pertaining to scholarships, and I think this is important. It's important because of where we go to school. I mean, some of you are going to be athletes, and we're transitioning from Division III to Division II, and as a result, we can offer scholarships. And I can tell you there are some of the coaches who are happy about that because they feel they can use that as a tool to leverage the athletes a little bit more. And they can. Don't get me wrong. They absolutely can. You don't do X, Y, Z, you get your money. So, it's a case where they can leverage the athletes. But the studies showed this, that athletes who were on scholarship exhibited a couple different traits. They found that while that scholarships themselves ended up lowering intrinsic motivation over time. And they found that as a student athlete went through a program, they had higher intrinsic motivation when they were younger as a freshman and less so as a senior. And I believe that would come down to how they feel as though they were being used and how their services are being purchased and where their actual motivation came from. It was no longer intrinsic for the love of the sport. It was extrinsic to continue to pay for their college education so they can graduate and move on to their career. But what they found was coaching style mattered more. And autocratic coaching behaviors produced lower levels of intrinsic motivation. So regarding intrinsic motivation, it appears that the type of coach one plays for is more important than whether or not they are on scholarship. So I would again have you take a moment and kind of reflect back, maybe in your body of work as an athlete, if you're an athlete, or even not an athlete and you've had interactions with managers, etc., and just think in terms of the different coaching styles. Were they overbearing? Were they autocratic? Were they more democratic? Were they very social? Did they have a collaborative environment? Or was it very much like isolation? And it matters, right? And that's going to matter more than some of the other extrinsic motivators that we saw earlier. I would urge you to take a moment to review the information found here. Try to become a little bit better acquainted with the effective use for external rewards. I'm not going to belabor you with reading through all these right here, but you got to understand with extrinsic rewards, it shouldn't be given to enable athletes. It should be given to enable athletes, not control them. And unfortunately, those extrinsic rewards, many times they feel as though they're in place for manipulation and for control. And I urge you to, again, take a read through this and start to think through some of the people you've had as coaches or leaders in your lives and if they exhibited some of these behaviors. Now, a competitive environment, and we've talked about this already, it can have an effect on intrinsic motivation. And when you look at intrinsic motivation, it'll be greater or higher after success, whether it's a competitive event where the team wins a game, or perhaps one-on-one where you dominate your opponent. But research showed that positive feedback for meeting the standard of performance, the task, not the actual outcome of the game, that helps in reducing the negative effect of losing. So you can still have a losing game, but still have a positive effect on intrinsic motivation if, as a coach, you're savvy enough to deliver content to talk more about task and less about outcome. And you find this where coaches often talk about losing the game when they're talking about outcome with their youth athletes, when they should be talking about many of the positive things that happen in the context of that game. You're not going to win every game. It's not too often you get to go undefeated, right? So you have to find ways to have little victories and little wins built into the process. And even in the game itself, you don't actually build those in because the outcome's unknown. You have to be able to recognize those and reinforce those with your athletes to help have help bolster intrinsic motivation. And a coach has an absolute direct influence, on the behavior of an athlete, 100%. And the things that coaches can do are teachable. And the interventions that can be used, many of them are tried and true, they're well proven, and yet there are still coaches who believe they should coach like they were coached when they were, 10 years old playing youth football with a dictator of a coach. You need to learn how to use these skills. Autonomy supported behaviors to increase intrinsic motivation is one of them. And I would I would present a little sidebar here for you as I've asked you to kind of think back in terms of your own body of work and coaches that you've had. What if you have a coach that has low intrinsic motivation? We're talking about having our athletes have high or increased intrinsic motivation and focusing on process, less on outcome, being able to be in the moment, enjoy the sport, etc. But what if we look at it from the perspective of working with a coach? What if that coach has low intrinsic motivation? Will they be able to effectively convey that message to their athletes and say, focus on process, do these great things. The outcome is the outcome. We can only control what we can control. I would think you have to look at different coaches. And believe me, having coached youth sports, there were some coaches who were definitely extrinsically motivated and they really missed the button when they were working with their athletes and having the opportunity to work with them. And I would contest that if you're a parent, sometimes you can't choose who your child goes with for a coach, but you might be able to quickly figure out how that coach operates. And then as a parent, not undermine per se, but just let your athlete or your son or daughter know, it looks like this coach has this type of coaching style. Here are some things you can do to be able to fit into that model a little bit better. So the text box to the right, I thought this was quite good, and I would take a moment to review this. I'm not going to bury you in these details, but they really talk about the effects of autonomy supportive and or versus controlling coaches styles. So you'll see an autonomy supportive coach, a controlling coach, the kind of characteristics of those, and then the outcome or the effects that you see with each population. Now, again, I've said it about 8 times. I'm going to say it 9. Go ahead and think back. Think back to people you've been involved with who are leaders and or in leadership roles with you, and kind of reflect on our different styles and see where they might fit in to this context. They provide, several strategies for increasing intrinsic motivation. I think they're quite good. Don't get me wrong, but I'll let you kind of read through at detail within each paragraph here. But I'll list them out for you. You have to provide for successful experiences, and I've talked about this. You try to find ways to have your athletes have small victories, or your patients in physical therapy have small victories. They don't have to start walking day 1 after a total knee replacement, though they will do some walking. But you may have to work on the very small things and have your person gain your trust and confidence in you to be able to do more. But you have to build in little successes along the way as like little stepping stones towards the bigger goal. You reward based on performance, not on outcome. You have to have verbal and nonverbal praise. Very content and sequence of drills. This is kind of a coaching programming thing, but I agree with this 100%. And then it comes from having a well laid out and mapped out program and good program design to be able to know how to teach different skills and integrate them all together. Involve participants in decision-making process, very much like when we were talking about a blocking technique when Jimmy was hand fighting. Jimmy, I think you probably could have done better on that. Do you have any input? Jimmy chimes in like, hey, I probably could have used a swim technique or this. And then the other athletes that are within his milieu, his group, can all chime in as well. And then you set realistic performance goals for your athletes. Not every athlete is going to be a all-conference performer or all-state, but you can set realistic performance goals that are not outcome-oriented like state or being all-conference. They can be something as simple as performance within the context of a training session. So with that, guys, I'm going to break out of this and move into the last presentation. I think it's the last one. I can't stress this enough. I say it all the time. You know, you start to look at it as a coach and start to evaluate your athletes. Start to look at it from the prism of you have to be intrinsically motivated as a coach to be able to work with your athletes, though you have extrinsic goals that help motivate you. But you have to understand, you have to have this kind of driver. If you want to have your athletes be intrinsically motivated, you as well have to have some sense of intrinsic motivation and some sense of internal locus of control. All right, guys, thank you, and moving on.